but is it true that there was a ceasefire? Like Putin had a press conference where he showed a document that he said was a ceasefire that then the United States apparently sent Boris Johnson over to Russia, Ukraine to basically blow up the agreement. Is that true?
Yes, this is fundamentally correct.
This wasn't a ceasefire. This was a peace deal before the war started, correct?
No, it was after.
Or this is what they claim?
There were rounds of negotiation before the war. Notably, there was a round of diplomacy between Blinken and Lavrov in January, the month before the war, where Blinken said that we cannot compromise on NATO's open door policy. That sort of diplomacy fell apart. But then after the war, there was a meeting of the Russian delegation and Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul under the supervision of Erdogan in Turkey. Naftali Bennett also had a similar process. In both cases, the West rejected a peace deal.
Allegedly. This is Putin we're talking about, right?
Let me come back. Well, hold on a second. Let me come back to the evidence for it in a second. But what the deal would have provided is that the Russians would move back to pre-war lines if the Ukrainians would agree not to become a member of NATO. However, the Ukrainians could still receive specified security guarantees from the West. That was the deal. Now,
allegedly.
We have now multiple data points. You've got Naftali Bennett saying that he thought a deal was attainable on these lines, but it was rejected by the West. You also have now Putin showing the very document which was signed by the Ukrainian delegation. So this was the document.
He flashed the document, right? Nobody has this document.
It hasn't been released yet. Yes. I hope the Russian government releases it for the purpose of history so we can inspect it. But nobody contests that this document is real. Remember, if he's just making this up, you would think that Erdogan would basically come forward and say, no, this is fake. There's too many people who are in that room who'd be able to say this document is fake. No one has done that. So I think there's every reason to believe this document is real. Now, it is not a final agreement. It appears to be a preliminary agreement or an outline. But the outline is that Russia is saying we will move back to pre-war lines if you agree not to become part of NATO. And that deal was rejected when Boris Johnson flew into Kyiv and basically told the Ukrainians, we do not want to make a deal with Putin. We want to pressure Putin. And the source for that is not the Russians. The source for that is a Ukrainian publication called Ukrainian Pravda, UP. And they ran an article in May of 2022 that I can put on the screen. And it is the source for saying that Boris Johnson came in and told Zelensky, we do not want to make a peace deal. We, the West, are not ready to make a deal with Putin. We want you to fight Putin or pressure Putin. And if you do, we will give you advanced weapon systems. And that is when the deal fell apart. If you look at the timing of it.
Yes, allegedly.
This happened.
None of this has been this has been lightly sourced here. So let's just be clear.
But you have to consider the source here. This is a pro-Ukrainian publication writing in May of 2022. Now, the tone of the article and what they basically say in this article is that Zelensky accepted Boris Johnson's offer. In other words, he took the gamble. And at this point in time, you've got to remember, this is 2 months after the war started. It looked like the Ukrainians were doing well. So UP was essentially praising Zelensky in this article for taking the West up on this deal to pressure Putin rather than make peace. Now, a year later, it looks like this gamble was a disaster.
Yeah.
And so that is the real conclusion here. A deal was available, but the West chose not to take it. By the way, Fiona Hill, who is a Russia hawk, and you could almost put her, I'd say, neocon adjacent, has basically said that this type of deal was available. The West did not want this deal.
I think, Jason, maybe to give you an answer, my thought is that this week was a very bad week for establishment politics and institutions. Because on the one hand, if you take the Russia incident and the Ukraine war, what you saw was that there were ample numbers of off-ramps that we chose, frankly, to not take so that we could engage our enemy in some long, drawn-out war on the hopes that it just depletes their resources. That's kind of rolling the dice, I think, in a very dangerous way. I think this week we also saw some published stuff on COVID and the COVID vaccine, which also debunked a lot of widely held truths. And it turned out that folks that may have been conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, were right there as well. So I think it's just an uncomfortable set of facts that, again, just reinforce that if you're not really thinking for yourself, you're not going to see the totality of what's actually going on. I think with respect to Russia, Ukraine, everybody has moved on. And so sadly, the only people that are left over are the people that have to fight the war, who are still separated from their families. There's the people that are dying. There was an article, I think today, they recruit prisoners, right? So obviously some of the prisoners that Russia uses are still pretty crazy. That person went on some rampage inside of a train, killed a couple people, stabbed some other people. There was just pictures of blood everywhere. I mean, this is just a horrible situation. And it's still not clear to me why we didn't take the off-ramp.
If in fact it's real. So I just want to keep putting that disclaimer out there, because Putin flashing a document doesn't make all this true. It doesn't mean it's not true.
What about Ukrainian Pravda?
Well, Jason, I would say.
What about Naftali Bennett?
I am just being clear here that none of this is confirmed.
Data points do you need?
I would say.
What are you talking about? Naftali Bennett confirmed it. What incentive does the former Israeli leader have to lie about this?
Here's what I would say, Jason. I think that something like that is so profoundly important that if it were not true, I think it would have been very important for the powers that be to discredit it almost immediately, so that they didn't have to look like they were warmongering unnecessarily.
Can I also up-level and connect to this point about the establishment? Because I think there's been a lot of pushback to even challenging the status quo, even having a conversation about Ukraine or having a conversation about COVID. And I think if there's one thing this pod represents, the fight going on at Twitter represents, is the need to have this conversation. If we look at the wars the U.S. has engaged in since September 11th, it's estimated 3 to 4 million people have died in Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We spent $8 trillion. Inflation adjusted, we spent $4 trillion in World War II. $8 trillion represents 25% of our entire national debt. And I've yet to meet a single parent who said to me, I care so much about this Ukraine situation, I would be willing to put my children in harm's way to fight for the defense of Europe. Okay, so those data points tell me at a very minimum, we need more of this discussion, more of this debate, not less.
The idea that we could be tiptoeing closer and closer to some land war in Europe unnecessarily. And I think the bigger issue is, and you can't trust what you're being told. And I think that that's what's very problematic.
That is a bigger picture. And just so we're clear here, I'm not saying I'm on either side of this. I'm just pointing out that this is all still very thinly sourced.
No, it's not.
Until the West confirms any of this,
what do you expect the West to do? You expect the State Department to issue a press release saying, yep, we fucked up, it's on me?
My theory,
what do you think they're going to do?
My theory from the beginning has been, and I've been very clear on this podcast, my theory has been since the beginning, they want to deplete Russia and they want to deplete their army and their capabilities and have regime change in Putin. Now, I'm not saying I'm for that, just for the people who are not listening.
I'm not debating that.
You said it would ankle Putin. That was the crude language you used.
That is what they plan on doing. Yes, I think that's what they're doing. And
Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, said that our purpose was to weaken Russia. Yes. So to knock it out of the ranks of the great powers.
Their purpose is. Yes, but I think they want regime change. Yes.
That's what Boris Johnson went to Kyiv and said. We want to pressure Putin, not make a deal with him. So they courted this war. They preferred.
That's been my theory since the beginning.
They prefer to fight a proxy war of choice that was easily avoidable.
I'm not endorsing that.
Take NATO expansion off the table.
This is not about you, Jason. I'm asking a simple question,
which is why. But Sachs just said it was, Tomas. So I'm just clearing it for the record. He just did. He said that was your position, and I'm correcting him.
Okay, fair enough, Jason.
I have the right to correct you. That was not my position. I said that's my theory.
I actually agree with you if you're saying that was our government's objective, which was to weaken Putin. I agree with you. They chose to fight an optional proxy war of choice that was easily avoidable if they'd just taken NATO expansion off the table because they thought it would weaken Putin.